Okay, we're going to start talking about how you get a job as a civil servant. How do you get hired to work for the federal government? Which is actually a lot of times very solid positions, a good job to have, unless, of course, we're shutting the government down and you get furloughed because of sequestration or budget cuts. But for the most part, it's a good job to have, and it has good benefits. There are a couple of myths about the bureaucracy that I want to clear up before we talk about bureaucrats. There is a myth that Americans dislike civil servants. That's just not true. We don't really have a problem with the individuals who work for the federal government. Our problem exists with the rules and regulations that those people are forced to carry out. Um, a lot of times when we get frustrated with paperwork through the federal government, like IRS, say you're filing your taxes and something goes wrong and you have to speak to an IRS agent, a lot of times we'll say, I know it's not your fault, or I know you're just doing what they tell you to. So we don't hate the people, but we do dislike some of the programs that they have to carry out. We believe that the federal government bureaucracy is getting larger. That's half busted, half confirmed. Actually, our federal government bureaucracy is decreasing, the size of it, and we are seeing, partly because of devolution revolution, or handing power back to the state and local levels, we're seeing larger state and local governments pop up. People believe that most of the people that work for the federal government live in DC, and that is totally busted. Only 12% of the people who work for the federal government work in DC. You can work for the federal government from anywhere from Alaska to Nebraska to Arkansas. It doesn't matter. There's federal government jobs all over the United States. A typical bureaucrat or civil servant, what do they look like? Somebody who works for the federal government. 47 years old, on average. Less than half of them have degrees. So, think about it. My parents are trying to get a job in the federal prison system. They don't have degrees. I don't even know if they really can read. I've never seen them read in my life. I'm assuming they can read a little bit, but they don't have degrees. So you could work for the federal penitentiary system. Not saying that everybody who works for the federal penitentiary system is an idiot. And I am saying my parents are idiots. Anyway, we're moving on. But you don't have to necessarily have a degree to work for the federal government. You got people who work in the military, or for the military, or within the military that don't have a degree. There are park rangers. There are welders who may be skilled technicians but not necessarily degreed. So that's not necessary. 55% of them are male, which compared to the makeup of Congress, that is a high percentage. It's more gender diversity than any other branch. Okay, most of them are white, but it's still reflective of our actual demographics of the country, more so than, say, Congress. And again, just to sum it up, the bureaucrats or civil servants are most like real Americans. Their demographics are more reflective of what we are as a U.S. population. The number one and two employers of the federal government, the number one employer is the military. So military personnel expenditures have increased, partly because we're at war, or have been at war. So that's the number one employer. Okay, and number two is the Postal Service. Evolution of the job. Okay, look, Constitution doesn't say anything about bureaucrats. Constitution does say that the president has the power to appoint advisors to assist him. So there was a need for advisors that were qualified. You saw George Washington created a cabinet of qualified individuals that could help him run the government. From 1787, though, to 1828, that qualification seemed to diminish. With Andrew Jackson, you see the beginning of the spoil system. And what Andrew Jackson, that term comes from the term comes from the phrase, to the victors goes the spoils. So to the victors of the wars go the gains of war. And Andrew Jackson believed one of the gains of winning the war of a presidential election is that you got to put in people that you liked and helped you get elected, whether or not they were qualified. There had been various attempts at reform, like especially during Grant's administration when there was corruption throughout the executive branch after Civil War. There were attempts to reform the spoils system to make people take competitive exams, but it was never really given serious backing or enough funding. Um, it really took an assassination of a president for the political agenda to justify real reform, and that was Garfield. Now, I hate Garfield the cat. I just don't like laziness, and I don't like people or cats that overindulge, or people for that matter. So, it's really easy for me to remember that Garfield was the president who was shot because I hate Garfield the cat. Anyway, just maybe now you won't forget it. But Garfield was shot by Charles J. Guiteau. I'm sure I'm butchering that because even though I am French, I don't speak French. But Guiteau was disgruntled because he was supposed to get a federal post. He helped Garfield in his efforts to get elected, and Garfield just kept on blowing Charles off and wouldn't give him the position that he had promised him. So Garfield's sitting there walking through the 6th Street station of Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, and bang, Guiteau takes him down. So then we realized maybe we really should reform the way that people are hired. If people are banking on getting these patronage jobs, if they help a president get elected to the point where they're willing to assassinate the guy, maybe the system might be a little corrupt. So we changed it. Now we have a civil service system. Most of the 2.8 million people that are working for the federal government are hired through the civil service system. In order to get the job, you have to take an entrance exam. So jobs only go to the most qualified, and there are special preferences for spouses of service members and veterans and people with certain disabilities, but you have to be qualified even if you are a spouse or a veteran. Now, this was established through the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This is an important act. This will pop up. You should really have known this from history. So what the Pendleton Civil Service Act did, it was passed after the assassination of Garfield in 1883. People are to be hired and promoted by merit. So you've probably heard of merit with the Boy Scouts. You get a merit badge if you could prove that you know how to do something. Well, the merit is you get the federal government job if you can prove that you're qualified for it, not prove that you know the right people. What that led to, the merit-based principle too, is the idea that you could get promotions using the general rating schedule. I'm going to go back. We'll wait for Hatch Act in a second. But the general rating schedule, if you have parents that work in the federal government, you might have heard of GS. So the general schedule goes from GS 1 to 18. And salaries can be keyed to ratings and experiences. So a GS 12 would make more than a GS 5. You get promoted proved on your talent and your skill, not on who you know. Okay, the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is another regulation on federal government employees. It doesn't really talk about how they're hired, but their behavior rather of when they get into their job. Bureaucrats must be politically impartial. That's what the Hatch Act of 1939 says. It's that you cannot engage in political activities like campaigning while you work for the federal government. Right? So you can't run for office, you can't fundraise, and you certainly can't campaign. So no campaigning whatsoever. The Hatch Act was passed during FDR's presidency. Most of the people who work for the federal government got their job because of the New Deal. So they definitely wanted to see FDR stay in office. So these bureaucrats were campaigning heavily for FDR, and really Republicans were frustrated, or non-FDR supporters were frustrated, saying that this is again more or less a spoil system. So that's why they passed the Hatch Act, is to say you can't campaign for FDR while you're on the job. Now, this was amended in 1993. We now allow federal employees to engage in political activities, but they have to be off duty. You can't do it you can't campaign while you're in your cubicle at your office, but you can campaign on your own time after work. So that was changed in 1993. But people in national security positions and people within the judicial branch are supposed to never participate in partisan politics. The OPM is the government agency that is responsible for monitoring and enforcing the Pendleton Civil Service system, the merit system, so that general rating service. And they also do the hiring. The OPM is the Office of Personnel Management. This is the office in charge of hiring most of your federal government positions. And when you visit usajobs.gov, like the monster.com of the federal government, it's going to say that OPM is the one that manages that. Okay. The Senior Executive Corps. The Senior Executive Corps is an elite cadre, or an elite group, of about 9,000 federal government managers. The Senior Executive Corps was established by the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. So the Civil Service Reform Act. These are your highest GS employees, GS 16 through 18. And basically these are an elite 9,000 federal government managers. So they're not like specialized in any particular thing except managing people and programs. And the president can move these people from one agency to another. So let's say if I was a member of the Senior Executive Corps, and currently I'm working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I'm running an office in Oklahoma, and I'm doing a bang-up job, and the president sees that they need some kind of management like that in Florida for FEMA. So then he could just move me to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's not about my specialty working with Native Americans, rather, but my specialty in managing the office. So that's the Senior Executive Corps. Hiring for regulatory agencies. This is where you find a new revolving door. So the problem with this is that, you remember the revolving door is people who work for the private sector then go work for the federal government, right? So they work for the private sector, then they work for the federal government, enforcing the rules that the private sector that they once worked for have to follow. So that would be like me working for Monsanto and then going to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and then going back to work for Monsanto. Instead of me being in Congress and moving to the private sector, it's me working for the regulatory agency that enforces rules into the private sector. I know this seems like it skips a little bit, but it's a bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily fit together. Presidential recruitment. Remember, these are the people that he appoints. These are the people that are going to mirror his ideology. These are your cabinet secretaries, your undersecretaries, your assistant secretaries. These are your top 3,000 posts in federal government. So these are even above the Senior Executive Corps. Again, he's going to look for like-minded thinkers. These people are going to need Senate approval, and they are not elected, so they are not easily removed from office. which is considered undemocratic kind of because they're enforcing laws, but they were not elected.